The government is corrupt. The political system is dysfunctional. Both political parties have not only failed us, they have betrayed us. We cannot trust them with our futures. We, the people, must take back control ourselves. Good evening, and welcome to the Revolution. And welcome to Revolution Radio and Revolution Television. We're doing a simulcast here, so some of you will be able to listen to it on your phones, on your computers, and even see it on our website. We'll tell you more about that later on. My name is Lawrence Hebron. We're going to begin tonight with our revolutionary look at the news. Headline: Will Alabama lead the charge in the coming revolt against the federal government? A federal judge in Mobile, Alabama ruled last month that Alabama must allow same-sex marriages. By so doing, the court struck down the state's ban against homosexual unions and set the stage for Alabama to become the 37th state nationwide and the second state in the Deep South to permit such marriages. Homosexual marriages are also legal in the District of Columbia. The United States Supreme Court refused to allow the marriages to be put on hold until after it was scheduled to hear arguments in April about whether there is a constitutional right for homosexual couples to marry nationwide. Accordingly, the way was cleared for homosexual marriages to begin in Alabama last week. In most other states, that would be end of story. But it appears that the rebel spirit is alive and well in the Yellowhammer State because many aren't taking this judicial dictate lying down. Last week, local officials in dozens of counties defied the federal judges and refused to issue marriage licenses to homosexual couples, which, as you can imagine, has the makings for a real constitutional crisis, and perhaps much more. Let's hope so. Homosexual couples were able to get licenses in about a dozen places, including Huntsville and Birmingham. But in most of the counties, officials refused to issue licenses to same-sex couples or simply locked the doors, shuttered the windows, and refused to issue any licenses for homosexuals or heterosexuals. The resistance was inspired in part by the urging of the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, Roy Moore. Justice Moore is best known for refusing to remove a monument depicting the Ten Commandments from the state Supreme Court's offices more than a decade ago. Oh, by the way, on that subject, the United States Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. has multiple depictions of the Decalogue, or Ten Commandments. Well, in response to the Alabama rebellion, the same U.S. District Judge who overturned Alabama's ban on homosexual marriages followed up by ordering a rebelling county to issue the licenses. The officials at Mobile County caved, opened its marriage license office, and started granting the documents to homosexual couples. Now, had there been a courageous constitutional sheriff in Mobile County with a constitutional posse or constitutional militias available, the judge's order would have remained in limbo, which is why we at the American Eagle Alliance urge in the strongest terms the election of constitutional sheriffs and the formation of constitutional posses and militias. Well, as you can probably guess, this is more than a mere protest. This is an outright attack against the alleged authority of the federal government to impose its perverse agenda while trampling over states' rights. And I applaud the action of the bold rebels in Alabama. Let's hope the movement spreads. Tonight, we are going to explore the deeper issues here, something which I find especially interesting and heartening, since what Alabama is doing is pretty much exactly the kind of thing that I proposed in my book, AR2, Handbook for the Second American Revolution. Well, let me get right to the heart of the issue and show why this rebellion is not only morally and legally correct, but also constitutionally proper, despite what a lot of so-called constitutional experts will be telling you. As was pointed out in AR2, the Constitution is not our founding document. The Declaration of Independence is. In fact, the Constitution was written to implement and institutionalize the philosophy of government embedded in the Declaration. What's that you say? You didn't know there was a philosophy of government in the Declaration? Yeah, well, you're not alone. Most people don't, thanks largely to our incompetent public school system. But you see, there had to be a philosophy of government included in the Declaration. You see, we were declaring to the world that we were entitled to rebel against the British because its government had become illegitimate. Specifically, it had not only failed to carry out its most solemn and sacred function of government, but that it had actually gone to war against the principles it was supposed to preserve, protect, and defend, much like our own federal government has been doing for decades. In order to show the legitimacy of our rebellion, we had to show the illegitimacy of the British government. And to do that, we had to declare what is the rightful role of government. We did that in the second paragraph of the Declaration, ironically hidden in plain sight, among the most memorized words of the Declaration. So let's review, and then I will shuffle the words just a bit to clearly reveal the philosophy of government, which is the foundation of our nation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And unfortunately, most people stop there. They need to go on another 10 words in order to perceive this as a philosophy of government and not merely a collection of platitudes. Those next 10 words say that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Hidden in plain sight is a philosophy of government that almost no one has perceived, at least in recent generations. Now, if I may be allowed to shuffle the verbiage a bit, the core responsibility of government becomes quite obvious and quite devastating to the agenda of the progressive deceivers and enemies of the true Constitution. Just read those memorable passages in reverse order, and here's what you get. Governments are instituted among men to secure these rights that are endowed by their Creator. The proposition of the Declaration is that government exists to do the work of God. Uh-oh, that kind of tugs on the rug that those separation of church and state people and atheists are standing on, doesn't it? Now, it's true that today's faithless generation may ask, which God? But that would not have been a question during the late 18th century. Reasonable estimates contend that well over 90% of the founders were committed Christians. So we can be pretty certain that they were referring to the God of the Bible. And if anyone tells you that they were mostly deists, just ask for proof. There is none. This is a completely unsubstantiated claim that was fostered by the malevolent and spread by the ignorant. Foremost among a government's responsibilities in accomplishing its work is securing, that is, establishing and protecting the rights of the people. This is so critical and so elemental that the people have the right to alter or abolish any government that becomes destructive of these ends, either through incompetence or deliberate design. Since the Constitution was written to implement and institutionalize the philosophy of government enshrined in the Declaration, it is clear that the true intent of the Constitution can only be understood by linking the two documents together, which is why I call this principle linkage. In effect, the Constitution must be read through the lens of the Declaration, or it will be misread. So, what does this have to do with homosexual marriage and, beyond that, the issue of states' rights? Everything. The vast majority of states oppose homosexual marriage and want no part of it. Despite this, it is being rammed down their throats by federal courts that accept the notion that homosexuals have the same right as heterosexuals to marry. Okay, now before I get into the good stuff and set off the nuke, let me comment on that and listen for just a moment. Don't react immediately and start throwing hard objects at your computer screen. I agree. homosexuals do have the same right as heterosexuals to marry, but I point out something a little bit differently than most others do. See, here's what it boils down to. Any homosexual woman is as free to marry a man as any heterosexual woman is. And any homosexual man is as free to marry a woman as any heterosexual man is. But marry someone of the same sex? No dice, Chicago. No one has the right to do that. And there is your equal protection of the law. Now, on to the bigger issue. America is all about rights. Accordingly, all kinds of nefarious special interest groups argue that they have the right to do whatever they want to do. They know that if they can make the claim stick to have a right to do what they want to do, they're home free. Homosexuals and their cheerleaders have played this game very well. They argue that they have the same right to marry each other that homosexuals have. I mean, that heterosexuals have, excuse me. But is that true? Well, neither the Declaration nor the Constitution talk about a right to marry, whether heterosexual or otherwise. Whenever we are uncertain as to what is a right and what is not, or where our rights end, we need to go back to the basics, to the basic principle. Now, since there is no specific reference about marriage in our founding documents, like there are specific references for the right to life, liberty, property, to alter and abolish abuse of government, etc., we have to go back to the basic principle to evaluate the homosexual's claim. So let's do that. First of all, again, remember the core statement of our philosophy of government. Governments are instituted among men to secure these rights that are endowed by their Creator. Those 15 magic words tell us everything we need to know. And it's a shame that our exalted justices don't realize that and don't take those words into account at all. So, let me explain it to them. Rights are endowed by our Creator, right? That's what it says. In other words, they're endowed by God or given to us by God. A right, therefore, is basically something that God gives us permission to do. Do you honestly think that God would give us permission to do something that He considers to be an abomination, detestable, and abhorrent? Of course not. And whether you're talking about Jehovah or Allah, and I wouldn't recommend the latter, I just throw that in so that even our president can clearly see what his position should be. Whether you read the Old Testament, the New Testament, or the Koran, again, I wouldn't recommend the latter, but I know the president understands what I'm talking about. It is clear that God does not approve of homosexual behavior of any kind. Ipso facto, there is no right to homosexual marriage or any other kind of homosexual behavior. Period. Case closed. End of story. This never should have made it to the county courthouse, much less the Supreme Courthouse. We are standing on rock-solid constitutional ground when we declare that there is no right to homosexual marriage. Whether or not they are allowed to marry is a matter for each state to decide, not the federal government. But how do the states exercise their sovereignty and enforce their laws when the feds get it wrong and then try to coerce the states to adhere to their perverse agenda? How do they do it? Exactly the same way Alabama is. Refuse to comply. The governor of Alabama, and presumably all the probate officials whose job it is to issue marriage licenses according to local laws, they all took an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, or words to that effect. That is their sworn duty. And they are not relieved of that duty just because some political appointee in a black robe gets it wrong. So, am I actually suggesting that these officials go against the ruling of the Supreme Court? Absolutely. Yes. If these officials can justify their position through the principle of linkage, which I described earlier, and in this case, they can. Remember, or I guess more likely learn, since most people don't know this, The Constitution never establishes the Supreme Court as the ultimate arbiter of the meaning of the Constitution. The Supreme Court would have you believe this, but it's not so. And even such a luminary as Thomas Jefferson said as much. He said that such a doctrine would establish the tyranny of the judiciary. And that's exactly what we see happening in Alabama. The tyranny of the judiciary trampling on states' rights. This state and most other states don't want anything to do with homosexual marriage, but the feds tell them otherwise. Well, Ian MacDonald has been listening and waiting patiently, so we're going to bring him into this conversation. First of all, I'd like to ask, what do you think of linkage, and ask you, do you agree with my statement that the core philosophy of government can be found in the 15 words, governments are instituted among men to secure these rights that are endowed by their creator, and also furthermore that we must read the Constitution through the lens of the Declaration? Do you think I'm on target here, or do you disagree?
Well, I fundamentally agree with that. Yeah, I believe the Constitution, I'm sorry, the Declaration of Independence is the foundation of our laws. It's the declarative formation of the country. I believe the Constitution is the implementation of those ideas set forth in the Declaration of Independence. We have to have the foundation before we build the house, so to speak. The Constitution is, in essence, the contract between the federal government and the states, and by extension of that, the people.
Okay, well, I'd ask people to pay attention, especially constitutionalists, because I know there are a lot of libertarians out there that have the kind of little bit of a loosey-goosey feeling, hey, if it ain't bothering me, go ahead and do it. And if I ain't bothering you, go ahead and do it. That was not the opinion of our founders, however. They were very much had libertarian principles, but they did see certain limitations to that. So what I would like to ask people to do right now is kind of shelve personal opinions for a minute and just listen to this logic and see what you think and see if it applies here. And so, Ian, I'm going to present the same thing to you. Tell me if my logic is correct. I argued that since our official position is that rights are endowed by our Creator, it therefore follows that rights are basically something that God gives us permission to do. The God of the founders and the God of the writers of the Constitution was the God of the Bible. That God does not approve of any kind of homosexual behavior, and therefore he would not give anyone permission to engage in any kind of homosexual behavior. So, is my logic good here?
Well, I agree and disagree some at the same time, and I thought you probably would see that coming. I approach this more from a libertarian point of view, as you know, where you primarily see it through the lenses of faith and theology. I fundamentally believe that the government has no place in determining who we spend our lives with, nor does it have a role in the private bedrooms of the American people. I think the writings of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are a set of guidelines and restrictions placed on the federal government, and I think that's a key point. The Constitution does not define marriage, and therefore under the 10th Amendment, which the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states and respectively to the people. So I see this solely as the preview of the state to define the legal contract of marriage. Ideally, the institution of marriage would be strictly between our Creator and the people involved and not the government. But unfortunately, things have become a little muddied, and I think that this complicates things a bit. You know, we have this is such a hotbed issue primarily because we have some legal principles here that also imply the rights of survivorship, the rights of parents and their children, the rights of property and estate, taxation, dealing with medical care decisions, the end-of-life decisions. And as a result, the Christian institution of marriage is no longer the only issues involved. I mean, there's a lot of substantial things involved here that you know, really does make this a little more complicated. You know, basically in the bottom, I agree with you that the federal government has no place in it. It is a states' right issue, and I think basically in the end the Supreme Court will probably overturn these bans based on the equal rights principles. So, as I said, yes, I agree, and yes, I disagree in some sense, and I think in the end the Supreme Court is going to basically be ramming it down the throats of the states in the end.
Now, we were standing a little bit differently, but I think we come to a similar conclusion. I'm pretty much standing rock solid on what the Declaration says about endowed by our Creator. I think that's a key phrase there. And that therefore, since the Creator, as the founders understood it, did not approve of homosexual behavior, that therefore there is no right to it. You're standing on the 10th Amendment, which is an excellent place to stand as well. But I think we both come to a similar conclusion. And basically, if the Supreme Court should get it wrong again, and I think by where I'm standing and from where you're standing, where we're looking at it, it is not right for the federal government, the federal courts, to mandate and dictate to the states on this issue. So would you say we both agree on that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Now, if the Supreme Court should get it wrong once again, now the question is, what should be, in fact, what must be the response of anyone who has taken the oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution? And I'm thinking particularly in Alabama right now, but really anybody who's raised their hand and taken the oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. If you are rock solid certain that the Supreme Court got it wrong, what are you obligated to do?
Yeah, there are the principles of nullification, I guess would be the best way to term it. And the only way that nullification can take place is by, as you said, having sheriffs and state officials that believe in the concept of overriding these laws based on nullification. And I think that what we'll see is there's going to be some of that, and that Alabama is the first example of it. Now, what if states were to step back and say, we will not issue any licenses at all, and those marriages are strictly between your priest or your pastor and the people involved? I think ultimately that's where it should be. I don't think the government has any business making those decisions, even the state government. But like I said, it has become complicated by those legal issues, and there has to be some way of handling those, and I think that's where the battle's going to be.
In terms of the battle, what I am proposing, both here on this program and in AR2, I am proposing open rebellion, if necessary, against an errant Supreme Court, not to go against our constitutional system, but to protect and preserve it, as our oath says. I am recommending open rebellion, if necessary, against an errant Supreme Court in order to protect constitutional rights and constitutional principles. Now, I know that this could lead to some trouble, but then so did the Declaration of Independence. So am I being too extreme?
I think by some people, yeah, you're probably going to be seen as extreme. There are a lot of issues that I think that we're headed in that same direction. I think the issues, like we talked last week about Second Amendment rights, the First Amendment rights, basically being able to choose what religion that we want to follow or not follow, what we want to think and what we want to say, and freedom of the press, which was an issue we talked about last week, Second Amendment issues. I think the Supreme Court is walking on eggshells in these decisions, and it very well could bring open revolt. The country is based on these Christian foundations, and I think that very few people are going to stand up for this, the direction that we're headed, unfortunately.
And I realize, I fully confess that this position of mine is a bit extreme, and that's not my goal. It's not my goal at all. At this point in my life, I would be very happy to just go retire quietly and putter around the house and do things with the family and all that. But unfortunately, the course that the government has taken, federal, state, county, city, just about all of them, will not allow me that luxury. And so we have come up with an approach here that will sound extreme to a lot of people, at least initially. But so did the approach of George Washington, John Adams, Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Patrick Henry, John Hancock, and all of those. And by I'll tell you what, I would be happy to be in their company, even if it is way at the end of the line, looking up to their example. Well, speaking about that and how we can make this happen, one of the keys in AR2 to changing America is the constitutional sheriff on a smaller scale and a constitutional governor on the larger scale. But right now we've been talking about Mobile, Alabama, and some of the counties there. So this puts it kind of in the area of the constitutional sheriffs. If Mobile, Alabama had a constitutional sheriff and a posse to back him up, the officials in Mobile County could have successfully thwarted the command of this errant federal judge. This is why the election of constitutional sheriffs and the formation of constitutional posses and militias to back them up is so critical to reestablishing the rule of the Constitution. A constitutional sheriff will declare certain things unconstitutional and will not enforce them in his county. And I've been privileged to be associated with the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, founded and run by Sheriff Mack, a wonderful organization. And I urge you to go to their website, cspoa.org, I think it is. I think it's an org, but try cspoa. something or other. I'm sure it's org. And these fellows have tremendous power. I mean, you could literally end Obamacare in your county with a gutsy constitutional sheriff. Now, that's my position, and I think we got to start doing something, digging in and making a stand someplace so we can start pushing back. That's my position. Ian, what do you have? I'll give you the last word on this topic before we move on to the next thing.
Well, as I've said in the past, I think I very much do believe in the theories of linkage. I think it's a strong element. I think it helps everybody understand the Constitution and its framework, how it was intended to be implemented. And at the core of those rights, we all individually have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That could be more equated to property, having our own property and maintaining our privacy. But, you know, so I think that linkage principle is very solid, and I think that we should be promoting that throughout the coming election cycles, and trying to push for those constitutional sheriffs, ideally constitutional governors, constitutional senators, and constitutional representatives. Unfortunately, politics gets a hold of most of those people, and they turn corrupt on us. So we've got to hold them to the fire. We've got to hold them to account.
And we'll tell you more about how you can learn about this plan at the end of the program. But now we want to turn things over to Ian, who has put together a really excellent and informative report that's also a very frightening one. Headline, War on Milk.
Kenneth Wright of Stockton, California, was visited by a SWAT team. If you're like most people, I'm sure the first image to pop in your head was something along the lines of a drug house, maybe a violent crime spree, maybe even a terrorist. No, this SWAT team was from the U.S. Department of Education. Yes, a SWAT team from the U.S. Department of Education. In June 2011, agents battered down the door of Kenneth Wright's home at 6 a.m. They dragged him outside in his boxer shorts, placed him on the ground, and handcuffed him in front of all of his friends and neighbors. His 3 children, ages 3, 7, and 11, were placed in a police car for over 2 hours while they searched his home. The raid was allegedly intended to uncover information on Wright's estranged wife, Michelle, who hadn't been living with him. She was suspected of college financial aid fraud. A year before the raid on Wright, a SWAT team from the Food and Drug Administration raided the farm of Dan Alger of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. His crime spree was shipping unpasteurized milk across state lines to a cooperative of young women with children in Washington, D.C. called Grass-Fed on the Hill. This highly dangerous substance called raw milk can be sold in Pennsylvania, but it is illegal to transport it across state lines. In this war on milk, the raid forced Alger to close down his business Most likely bankruptcy followed, as I'm sure the government prosecution would take tens of thousands of dollars to defend against. I have said on this show and others that I believe we are in a police state now. Some look at me like I'm some kind of right-wing extremist nutcase. Well, let's take a close look at it, and I'll let you make the call for yourself. Do you think the examples I cite above are abnormal? How about a heavily armed response to illegally grazing cattle in the case of Bundy Ranch and the Bureau of Land Management? I find it interesting that many people don't stop to ask why the Bureau of Land Management has a SWAT team. A SWAT team for grazing cattle? Really? And then they wonder why the people who are paying attention reacted the way they did. Well, this, my friend, is only the tip of the iceberg. Here's a list of federal agencies that have law enforcement powers. In a report by Robert Longley, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics in 2008, the census on federal law enforcement officers, combined federal government agencies employ about 120,000 federal full-time law enforcement officers who are authorized to carry firearms and make arrests. Few people would be surprised to see federal agents on the Border Patrol, FBI, U.S. Marshals, or Secret Service carrying guns and making arrests. To complete this list, though, we have to look at U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Federal Bureau of Prisons, Federal Bureau of Investigation, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, U.S. Secret Service, Administrative Office of the U.S. Court, the Drug Enforcement Administration, U.S. Marshal Service, Veterans Health Administration, Internal Revenue Service, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives. That's not the complete list, though. If those names don't raise much concern, how about these? U.S. Postal Inspector, U.S. Capitol Police, National Park Service, Bureau of Diplomatic Security, Pentagon Force Protection Agency, the U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, the National Nuclear Security Administration, the U.S. Mint, Amtrak, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Bureau of Land Management. How about the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, Food and Drug Administration, the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, Tennessee Valley Authority, the Federal Reserve Board, the U.S. Supreme Court, the Bureau of Industry and Security, the National Institutes of Health, the Library of Congress, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and my favorites, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the Government Printing Office, National Institutes of Standards and Technology, the Smithsonian National Zoo, and the Bureau of Reclamation. However, missing from this list is the U.S. Air Marshals, Department of Homeland Security, and also the list also includes the U.S. Coast Guard. Can anyone please tell me why the hell we need all that? Add to this list your local police, the county sheriff, the state police, or CHP, and game management, and you can't even fish without the blessing of the government. So please excuse me when I become concerned when the government is buying billions of rounds of ammunition, and the purchaser is not the U.S. military. Posse Comitatus Act of the United States federal law that it was passed in June 18, 1878, after the end of the Reconstruction era. It was updated in 1981. The purpose of the act, in concert with the Insurrection Act of 1807, is to limit the powers of the federal government in using the military personnel to enforce state laws. So the government just made the law enforcement community equal to the military. Add president's appointees like Attorney General Eric Holder to pick and choose which laws he wishes to enforce, and as I pointed out last week, thinks that he has the power to even enact laws. Yes, folks, I believe we're living in a police state. The only thing between the American community of law enforcement officers in countries and police departments like the Gestapo or the Stasi is the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and their oath to uphold it. What say you, Lawrence?
Well, to me,
Kenneth Wright of Stockton, California, was visited by a SWAT team. If you're like most people, I'm sure the first image to pop.
There we go. We had a little technical difficulty. I think we're okay now. Are we okay now?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. You're asking what my reaction to this is, and to me it's just shocking to think how many federal agencies out there have their own police forces. Now, some of these, yeah, FBI, Secret Service, Capitol Police, sure. You got to figure they've got to have some police. You know, I'm even willing to see certain possibilities for such things as U.S. forestry. You know, a lot of things go out there, national parks. People are out there doing some stuff. They got a lot of ground to patrol, and there are a lot of criminals that are trying to pull stuff off of there, drugs and the likes. U.S. Mint, okay, you know, people come in there, might be looking for some free money, but come on, so many of these other things. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NASA, Federal Reserve Board, Tennessee Valley Authority, National Institutes of Health, the Smithsonian National Zoo, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. I mean, come on, this is outright ridiculous. I mean, what the heck does the National Zoo need with its own police force? To keep the baboons from taking over the Congress and the White House? Oh, wait a minute. I think
that might be an improvement there.
Yeah, I think we might be too late for that. Maybe the zoo should have its own police force. They're just a little too close to the Capitol Mall. But I guess I have two things to say about this. First, it is frightening to see how much armed force is being collected and arrayed against we the people by our government. And you have to wonder why. I mean, who's the enemy here? Who are they getting prepared to use all those bullets against? And a lot of them are hollow points. And as you pointed out, it sure seems that this might be a way to get around the protection supposedly provided by the Posse Comitatus Act. We, the people, are supposed to be secure from the deployment of the military against us in our own homeland. But, and I guess maybe I could quote Hillary Clinton here, what difference does it make if they come at us in camouflage uniforms or in a black polo shirt? Probably much like what happened with Kenneth Wright, whose home was stormed by a SWAT team from the U.S. Department of Education. Did I get that right? The U.S. Department of Education has a SWAT team?
Evidently.
Well, considering what they've been doing to the schools, I guess maybe that does make some sense. My second point is this, though, and it's not as serious one, but I think it is still something we need to consider. If the Bureau of Reclamation really thought that it could use some police assistance, then why couldn't they just contact some local police or sheriff agency, or perhaps some unified federal police agency that farms out agents on an as-needed basis? I think here again is another example of bureaucratic empire building with massive duplication of effort and expense spread out among the various elements of the sprawling federal bureaucracy. Here's an example of your tax dollars at work and your liberties at risk.
I think you've got that pretty well summed up. I mean, we really got to question the need for all of this. And again, I'd wholeheartedly agree. We need, to have a force like the FBI. We need to have the Secret Service to protect our leaders. Most of those are very valid uses of law enforcement authority. But what I question, what I have a problem with, is this redundancy, this empire building, as you put it, where all of these little agencies think that they have to have their own little, I hate to use the term, but almost like they have to have their own little Gestapo. So now we have situations, like you said, the Department of Education has a law enforcement division, the EPA. Why? What's the need behind this? And we need to seriously start asking questions about why they're buying billions of rounds of ammunition. Well, they say, well, training. Typically, you don't use hollow point ammunition to go train. You use inexpensive ammunition. Oh, but wait. It seemed to me that I just read something yesterday where didn't Obama, through a executive order, tell the ATF to ban ball ammunition for the 223 5.56 round that is used in AR-15s, M16s? Why could that be? Why are they using these back end runs around the Constitution to implement what they think the policy should be? The Constitution's a law. not what they think it should be. At some point, these forces are going to be arrayed against us. And as you were saying earlier, we have got some serious decisions to make as a people. Are we going to roll over and allow this to happen, or are we going to fight it? And it's pretty spooky when you think about the implications of it.
Again, I think it's all the more reason that we make sure we have constitutional sheriffs with constitutional posses, and where they aren't available, to form our own constitutional militias. I mean, that's the only way we can keep ourselves safe. And one more issue here on that whole matter of the bureaucratic efficiency. Where's the command and control of all of these different police officers and police agencies? What if they ever had to coordinate with one another? Is there a way to tie them all together? I mean, we see this over and over again. That was one of the points made during the last presidential campaign by one of the candidates that was contending. We have something like, I think it was 156 different agencies that deal with welfare at the federal level. I mean, how efficiently is that going to be coordinated? And now you look at all these different agencies and all the well over 100,000 different officers that are going to be sent hither and yon to pursue some kind of objective. Well, how do you coordinate and control all that stuff? The command and control has got to be a nightmare. But that's another issue. I think the big one here too is, what do they need all that force for? What's going on with this ammunition issue, like you've been bringing up? Why do they need all these hollow points? It just doesn't make sense for training or anything else. Only way it makes sense is if they're going to use it on the people. So again, there's some very scary things going on here.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's the reason that I keep bringing it up, is that most people have this vision of their head when they think of law enforcement of like the old Adam 12 series, or even unfortunately Barney Fife. They have these visions of these noble police officers that are there to protect them and to protect their property and our way of life. And for the most part, I think the overwhelming majority of the law enforcement officers are just that. They believe in those same principles that we do. However, unfortunately, we have some things moving in the country that really concern me, and I think one of the ones that concerns me the most is the Department of Homeland Security. As you know, it's up for refunding at the moment, and they're talking about what would happen if the Department of Homeland Security wasn't funded and it was forced to shut down. I don't think it's such a dramatic loss. I don't see where they've really contributed anything other than they've gobbled up a bunch of other departments. We really need to start asking these questions of why. Why do we need this? What does it do? What does it perform? What have they done for us? We spend billions of dollars to fund this monstrosity at the government level called Department of Homeland Security, and we already have a Department of Homeland Security, and it's called the Sheriff's Office. It's called your local police, and to a certain extent, it's called the state police and the National Guard and the militia. The militia is a very key part of this. We have the right to protect ourselves. We have the right to be free from overzealous intrusion by the federal government. We just keep stacking more law enforcement agencies on top of the other, and we start arming them with military vehicles, military equipment, drones and helicopters and MRAVs, and some of these local podunk sheriff's departments are running around with M60 machine guns on boats, and I got to ask, why? What are they fighting against? And then we hear the Border Patrol basically isn't even enforcing our immigration laws. So why do we have them?
That's an excellent point. If they're not even going to enforce the law, then why do they need all those enforcement weapons? Yeah. So we have a very bad situation here. And Homeland Security, I mean, think about this. And people say, well, we've got terrorists. We've got all these dangers to us. Hey, we survived as a nation for what, roughly 90% of our history without the Department of Homeland Security, and we did okay. We don't need that. We need something to coordinate all those different agencies that you talked about, and certainly Homeland Security ought to be rooted in the homeland, which means the constitutional militias. We put them together. We have a way to coordinate them. That's going to be one of the best ways to protect ourselves, especially with the growing danger from, as I will say it, Mr. President, Islam and Islam terrorists. And not just Islam terrorists and radical Islam, but Islam, period. We're going to be talking more about that in future episodes of Revolution Radio and Revolution Television. But before I move on to the This Week in History, anything else on this topic, Ian?
I think that about covers it.
Okay, well, I know we'll be talking about it some more. It's an ongoing issue, and it seems like the government just keeps stirring the pot. So thank you for all of that. Well, as you know, we here at Revolution Radio and now Revolution Television, we want to encourage a reconnection with our proud heritage, a remembrance of America the Great. And so a regular portion of our program each week is to review events that happened in this last week in American history. So we're going to go back right now to February the 11th and bring it up to 1 week. February 11th, 1752, Pennsylvania Hospital opened in Philadelphia. It was the first hospital in the American colonies, 1752. 1809, Robert Fulton patented his steamboat. Have you ever heard the term gerrymandering? Yeah, well, 1812, on February the 11th, Elbridge Gerry, the governor of Massachusetts, signed a law that called for redrawing electoral district lines to favor his party to give them an edge, giving rise to the term gerrymandering after his last name, Gerry, a practice that is still very much alive today, unfortunately. 1861, one day before his birthday, President-elect Abraham Lincoln left his home in Springfield, Illinois for Washington, D.C., saying, "I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return." As fate would have it, Lincoln would never see his hometown again. He returned in a casket a little more than 4 years later. 1933, President Herbert Hoover designated Death Valley as the national monument. And if you think, wait a minute, 33, wasn't that when FDR came in? Yes, but remember, we weren't inaugurating presidents in January, on January 20th back then. So these were some of the last days of Herbert Hoover's administration. February the 12th, 1809, Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin near Hodgenville, Kentucky. He would become the 16th president of the United States. 1973, Hanoi began to release American POWs following the end of the Vietnam War. 1999, President Bill Clinton was acquitted of charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. He is only the second president to be impeached. The other was Andrew Johnson back in 1868. And in 2001, the Near-Earth Asteroid Rendezvous spacecraft landed on Eros. It was the first landing on an asteroid. Moving on now to February the 13th, 1635. The oldest public school in America was founded in Boston. Now that's the public school. The oldest schoolhouse, especially the oldest wooden schoolhouse, is down in St. Augustine, Florida. 1795, the first state university in the United States, the University of North Carolina, began its operations. 1826, the American Temperance Society was founded back in 1826. It was the first national organization to advocate prohibition. Took a little while for them to get there, and then it was overturned a few years later. 1935, Bruno Richard Hauptmann was found guilty of murdering the kidnapped son of Charles and Ann Lindbergh. And in 2000, the last Peanuts comic strip ran one day after the death of cartoonist Charles Schulz. February the 14th, 1778, the United States ship Ranger carried the Stars and Stripes to a foreign port for the first time when it sailed to France. 1849, James Polk became the first president to be photographed in office. Now we can't get the current president to stop taking pictures of himself. 1859, Oregon became the 33rd state, and in 1912, Arizona became the 48th state. 1946, think about this date, 1946, the electronic numerical integrator and computer was introduced at the University of Pennsylvania. It was the first general-purpose electronic computer. February the 15th, 1764, St. Louis, Missouri was founded as a French fur trading post. 1799, Pennsylvania authorized the first printed election ballots in the United States. Our research team here at Revolution Radio is still working on who invented the first hanging chads. So more on that as we find out. We'll pass that on to you. 1820, women's suffrage leader Susan B. Anthony was born in Adams, Massachusetts. 1898, the USS Maine mysteriously blew up in Havana Harbor, killing more than 260 crew members and sparking the Spanish-American War. 1933, President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt narrowly escaped an assassination attempt in Miami. February the 16th, 1804, naval officer Lieutenant Stephen Decatur led a daring raid into Tripoli Harbor to burn the U.S. frigate Philadelphia, which had been captured by the Barbary pirates. 1861, Jefferson Davis was sworn in as the provisional president of the Confederate States of America at Montgomery, Alabama. He would remain the CSA's president throughout the Civil War. 1937, DuPont scientist Wallace H. Carruthers received a patent for nylon. 1945, American troops recaptured the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines nearly 3 years after the infamous Bataan Death March. And our last date for right now, February the 17th, 1801, the United States House of Representatives broke an electoral tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, selecting Jefferson to be the third president of the United States. Aaron Burr became his vice president because of the rules of the elections at that time. 1817, the first gas street light was ignited on a public street in Baltimore, Maryland. And in 1864, the Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley became the first sub to sink another warship, which was the USS Housatonic. The Hunley itself later sank after the attack. And that is this date in American history. Well, if you're getting the feeling that the Republicans and Democrats don't have a clue about how to fix what they've broken, or maybe they aren't even trying too hard because the system is working pretty well for them, you might want to try something different. And that would be the American Eagle Alliance, which is bringing you this program. The American Eagle Alliance is leading the charge in fighting the Second American Revolution, AR2. Among other things, we conduct Patriot Training Days that will teach you and your organization how to fight and win the Second American Revolution in less time than it took to win the first, without taking over the White House, the Congress, the Supreme Court, or any constitutional amendments. In 1776, we the people rocked the world. It's time to do it again. I guarantee you this will not be a rehash of tired old failed ideas from the Republicans and Democrats, liberals, conservatives, left or right. This is as old as 1776 and as new as tomorrow. This is historic, it is vintage American, and it is heroic. It will change everything. If you'd like to schedule an event for you and the Patriot organizations in your area, please call 909-913-7878. Again, 909-913-7878. Or if you'd like me to come by and discuss any of the ideas found in Solutions, Guidebook for Rebuilding America the Great, or AR2, Handbook for the Second American Revolution, you can schedule that by calling that same number, 909-913-7878. Both those books, by the way, are available through bookstores, but probably the easiest way to get them is, and cheapest way, is at Amazon. Just search under my name, Lawrence Paul Hebron, H-E-B-R-O-N. We also have a theme song for the American Revolution, and we will be gearing up to play that for you here in future episodes. I don't think we're quite to that point yet, but it's quite a kicky tune. It only costs 99 cents on iTunes. Look for it under my last name, Hebron. I wrote it. I did not sing it, so don't give me the credit for that. I don't have the voice for singing. It only costs 99 cents, but whenever you buy it or Solutions or AR2, you help to fund the revolution. And if you're interested in bulk rates for Solutions and AR2, we have people calling about that. Yes, they are available. Again, call 909-913-7878. Well, we always like to give you one more thing to think about before we sign off. We have a quote of the day. And today our quote of the day comes from a luminary whom we mentioned earlier in the program. Here it comes. The Constitution on this hypothesis is a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary, which they may twist and shape into any form they please. Thomas Jefferson in a letter to Spencer Roane. They may twist it and shape it as long as we allow them to. So patriots, stand up, dig in, fight back. Don't allow them to. Alabama, hang in there. Well, thanks for listening, and tell your friends that they can listen to us on AEA4USA.com. We hope you will continue to tune in and listen to future episodes as well, where we always try to talk about something more than what you hear on other news and commentary programs. We don't want to just tell you stuff you've already heard. We want to give a new slant on it, go a little bit deeper, go a little bit farther. Okay, thanks again for listening. Now let's get cracking, patriots. We've got a country to serve.